So we have some time for questions. I'd love to open up to the audience. I think I have a few of my own, maybe to kick off a little more conversation around some of the things we've talked about here today. But first, let's go to all of you and see if you've got questions for any of our speakers.
My question is targeted more towards Bonnie and Carl. If you can address with your experience, and Carl, you definitely mentioned this during your presentation, was that these preventative screenings and procedures are covered with the new provisions with the Affordable Care Act. I was wondering if you've actually seen any increases in use for those devices and those medical services. If you've had any numbers or statistics in terms of increased use.
Well, I'll take a shot. No, I don't think we can parse it out at that point. In fact, I think the effectivity of some of these changes is actually the 2013 timeframe. So I don't think it's easy to tell at this point. I do believe that in talking with physicians and others who are involved in policy aspects of it, they are hopeful that what we will see is an expansion of people taking advantage of the screening modalities that are already there. So in other words, that more people will come in because the co-pays for a variety of services, mammography among them, is taken care of. There will be fewer disincentives for people showing up. And we do know that there are effects at the end of the year with people using up deductibles and then consuming more health care, and maybe the same kind of thing will happen. But I can't quote you any numbers at this point.
No, I don't think we've seen enough of a change, because part of it is funding, but it's also education and awareness, so they have to happen together.
So Lisa, I have actually, oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Just for, I think, everyone's kind of education, you mentioned that you have made it your mission, that you're doing some advocacy work, and it's really important to you. For others who have been touched by these sorts of diseases and other cancers that have very low rates of diagnostic tests and everything, how would you recommend getting started in that sort of advocacy work? Like, where is a good starting point, particularly for the GYN cancer?
I'm glad you asked that question, because I neglected to leave out some other friends who are in the audience, which are my friends from the National Race to End Women's Cancer, which I've been a spokesperson for a couple of years, and the National Race benefits the Foundation for Women's Cancer, which is a leading research organization for all GYN cancers. So your question was where to go in terms of, yeah. So as it relates to gynecologic cancers, there's a number of organizations. There's the Foundation for Women's Cancer, which is unique in that it encompasses all 5 of the GYN cancers. And is focused on research grants and patient education. As it relates to ovarian, there's the Ovarian Cancer Research Fund based in New York. There's the Ovarian Cancer National Alliance, which I know works with AdvaMedDx on some things here in Washington, and that's the leading public policy organization. There are smaller grassroots ovarian cancer organizations in markets all across the country, but those are the leading GYN cancer. There really isn't a cervical cancer alone. That's more encompassed in the foundation, which does a lot focused in the cervical cancer space. Those are the ones that I would recommend, and I found them simply by having lots of time on my hands on the web when I was in the latter parts of treatment and looking for places to get plugged in. But I will just make my personal plug for the race, which is here in Washington every November. It's November 3rd next year. And it's a great inspirational morning and run around Freedom Plaza and the Hill and everything. And so come out if you have any interest.
Great, thank you. Other questions? One of the resources I would just take the time to mention, there's a link on our website, but call it out for all of you. There's an organization called Lab Tests Online. It's a web-based educational resource about diagnostic tests, and I commend it highly because it provides information that's searchable either by the test or the health condition. There's a lot of great information on there in terms of what the tests actually do, what kind of information they provide, how to understand that information as a patient. It's entirely a patient-centric resource, and it's a great one. I encourage you to check it out. Lisa, I had actually wanted to follow up with you a little bit. The test that you mentioned, MammaPrint, is of course manufactured by one of our member companies. It's a relatively new, sophisticated genetic test, of course, approved by FDA. But these kinds of tests are obviously relatively new in terms of either both doctors as well as patients understanding that they're available and what their benefits are. Do you have any insights into the extent to which, you feel like women are becoming more aware of these tests, that they have options to go for these kind of testing, especially when they're confronted with, as you said, the burdens of chemotherapy that they might not have to go through. What's your perspective on this in terms of patient
The only
awareness?
reason I had that test was because they were just testing it out in our hospital at the time. So my insurance, I didn't even have to go through insurance or anything. It wasn't covered by insurance. It was just offered from the company Agendia. But every year I go to the Agendia sales meeting and I talk to the new sales representatives that are going, out there in all the states in, the United States. And they're, trying to get doctors and surgeons to realize that this test exists. And they do work with patients and insurance. And but what I do is I try to motivate the salespeople, because they are there for a job, they're selling this test, but they don't know how much it impacts people, women who do experience, even men who experience breast cancer. So I like to speak to them and motivate them, and it seems to do a good job, like meeting me or meeting people that do have had success with this test. I know that in the hospital I work at, they use it now with everybody, which is a good thing. Every time I hear about somebody that's breast cancer, since so many people know me, I'm on Facebook, people send their friends to me to talk about it, and I always advocate this company, make sure you ask your doctor about it. There's also another test out there, I think the Oncotype, but the Agendia Symphony panel test is something that really our doctors and the director of our cancer center at St. Luke's is definitely an advocate for. So,
Great, thank you.
yeah.
Appreciate that perspective.
Mike? And you and Carl mentioned sort of the challenges on reimbursement. I think you mentioned Medicare, but I was in a meeting yesterday with Dr. Shari from ONC about HIT, telemedicine, which also has a challenge of getting reimbursement from Medicare payers for it. But in concept, it's a much more efficient, effective way to deliver care or increase diagnostics. But we talked about how, in Medicare specifically, 25% of people are already in Part C, which Medicare HMOs, so fee-for-service doesn't matter there. The HMOs make their own decisions. And then another 3-4 million are in shared savings programs for the ACOs. More are going to be in bundle payments. So I'm wondering if you can talk more about how, proving the cost effectiveness to the clinicians, to the larger health systems. And because it really seems that Medicare fee-for-service reimbursement issues is looking backwards, and moving forward it's going to be, people call bundle payment, global payment, episodic payment. And, you talked about, Carl talked about the trichomonas being cost effective. For Lisa's situation, not having to give everybody chemotherapy, that's certainly good for patients who don't need it, and it's also cost effective. So those kinds of diagnostics, breakthroughs can make, both clinical sense and economic sense. So talk more about how you guys are approaching that kind of new value-based reimbursement systems.
Right, thank you. I think that's a really insightful question. Obviously, our work on Medicare specifically is all about trying to, at least in the shorter term, amend the way they set rates under the clinical lab fee schedule, which is based on time and materials and goes way back, decades ago. So it has no relation to current technology, impact on patient care. As you said, however, I think there's a lot more dynamic thinking going on outside of Medicare system and more in the, the private payers and healthcare institutions as they think about more effectively about care from all the way from screening to outcomes and follow-up monitoring, right? And in that setting, the value proposition for diagnostics is really powerful, as you said. And there's multiple examples of how employing a diagnostic at relatively low cost early on can influence, inform, and sometimes even completely dictate decision-making around what drug someone gets and what kind of treatment that, besides therapeutics or follow-up care they get. And so you're taking tests that may cost only hundreds of dollars, in some cases maybe a few thousand for very sophisticated tests, but you're driving decisions that are measured in the tens of thousands, if not more. So there's clearly a huge value proposition, and if you're an institution that's really thinking about how to make the right investments where in the system, diagnostics is one of those places where you really want to be much more aggressive at making the right kind of investments. But our work as an industry overall and as an advocacy organization in that area is primarily to continue promoting value of diagnostics overall, trying to raise a general level of awareness among payers, especially, a range of payers that aren't as sophisticated in thinking about value of diagnostics specifically, and generally getting the word out among clinicians and so forth. I would certainly invite Carl and Bonnie to speak to that as well, who have a lot more sort of on-the-ground experience in getting tests more widely adopted.
Look, I think you hit the nail on the head. This is the essential chicken and egg dilemma when it comes to advanced technologies, new technologies, and their application. And I think it's going to be incumbent on all of us, public payers, as well as private payers and new accountable care organizations, to be innovative in our thinking. It is a fact that if the standard that we want to apply is that no new therapy or no new treatment or no new diagnostic should come into regular use until we have completed a thorough comparative effectiveness review of years' worth of peer-reviewed literature and blessed a technology as being the right one, that there will literally be decades of people's lives lost because of that inertia and that really willingness to do nothing new unless we can prove that it does no harm. There are innovations that happen that prove not to be ultimately what we thought they should be, but I think that's part of discovery, that's part of science, and that's part of medicine. So we do need to have a system that's tolerant of new technologies, that allows for the demonstration of the utility of technologies, and even early on, if that's anecdotal demonstration, can pave the path to ultimate proof positive that something should be fully encompassed. So I would argue that transitional approvals, even if we talk in the diagnostic business about regulatory barriers to some of these technologies, the approval of diagnostics with early information, but perhaps not complete information, with a commitment to follow up, is one example of that. The addition of new therapies to either the equivalent of a formulary or accepted practice and reimbursement by payers. You're going to have a generation of risk takers in order to deliver the best possible care and make sure that these advances get to patients quickly. That's just, and I'll speak that personally, and I think that view extends from the kinds of things we're talking about here to new technologies of all kinds.
And the only thing I'd add would be, it's incumbent upon industry to really bring forth the economic and clinical benefits of the technology, but at the same time, we'd like to see a shift to seeing the true value that the technology brings, as opposed to, as you'd referenced, a more cost-based system.
Yeah, and there certainly are payers that are very much more aggressively driving through their own policies the use of certain diagnostics in certain clinical settings. They've said, for example, you will not give this drug or any drug before you do X test, knowing that the use of that test, widely adopted, is in fact going to drive cost savings and better care, cost savings through better care. So there are certainly specific examples. And in the field of companion diagnostics, which is what personalized medicine is all about, right? Y'all kind of know at least the buzzword of personalized medicine. At the core of personalized medicine, although it's not only this, our diagnostics specifically tell you whether or not a patient, based on genetic or molecular markers, is a candidate for a drug. Those tests are increasingly, I think, the subject of payer policy for adoption, because they know those tests really must be performed before therapeutic selection, because you're going to, increase your efficacy rate, reduce side effects for patients who need them, and so forth. So there's a clear case in kind of that companion diagnostics personalized medicine model for why widespread adoption of diagnostics should be moved faster. But of course, there's a value proposition there for many other kinds of diagnostics as well. Other questions for our panel? Yes.
How are these diagnostic tools used in European countries with their national health insurance programs? And what are the differential incidence for the kinds of cancers that you've been focusing on here? Are they comparable, or are they less? And since many of these drug companies are multinational also, I'm wondering to what extent you have to prove the effectiveness of the technology in different countries instead of it being accepted in an international context.
Well, I'm going to defer to our folks from our companies to see whether they have some perspective on cancer incidence rates globally in different countries and so forth. Let me speak briefly to the other aspects of your question. First, to say on your last part in terms of approvals from different countries, there certainly is a challenge on a couple different fronts with regulatory approvals worldwide. A couple of things. One is the varying acceptance of regulatory authorities to take clinical data that's generated from other countries. That can be one challenge. And there are some countries as well that require a regulatory approval in your country of origin before you go on the market in their country. And that's particularly a challenge for those in the U.S. because of some slow timeframes at FDA. So you're looking at systems where, for example, in Europe, which has a system basically where you can get to market more quickly, you're looking at a situation where companies can go to market in Europe and then be here at FDA for multiple years waiting for approval. So that's certainly a big challenge. So there are some challenges, differing scenarios worldwide for the diagnostics industry and similar issues for the companion pharmaceuticals too. I think to your very first question in terms of European approvals, there is a centralized regulatory approval system in Europe, but there's a widely varying reimbursement system. So payment actually comes out of every country separately, and in some countries, multiple jurisdictions within a given country. So payment is highly fractionated, but there is a central regulatory system, and without going into a whole lot of details, the bottom line is it's easier to get on the market in Europe by certifying to the efficacy of your test, and yet there are similar, rates of patient outcomes and so forth. So we see basically a more effective regulatory system in a sense with similar outcomes for patients.
Let me put a sharper point on Andy's point there. The reality of regulatory systems globally is that each country is becoming different. The EU is behaving in a concerted fashion, which is very helpful and does allow you to cross some of the regulatory hurdles in a concerted fashion, as Andy mentioned. But very importantly, what we're finding is that many of the new technologies that are ultimately approved here in the United States are in fact approved 2 or 3 or 4 years earlier in the EU or in other markets. And that is a result of our specific regulatory system. I've had this discussion with Jeff Shuren multiple times. He'll take an opposite view of this, but the fact of the matter is, in my company, and we have numerous products that we have on the market globally and have been approved by regulators in multiple different countries, I can tell you with certainty that every product I have had reviewed and put on the market internationally before I have put it on the market was ultimately cleared in the United States in exactly the same form that it was originally marketed outside the United States. We made no changes. We had to do additional clinical studies. We had to add a lot of information. We had to go through multiple review cycles, but it is the exact same product. So if you ask what the incremental benefit of a more rigorous regulatory regime is, I am struggling to find an answer to that question. Now, when it comes down to specific diseases, they certainly do vary on a global basis, and countries will make varying different decisions. As an example, in many countries, gonorrhea is not a significant public health threat, and people don't screen for it. But in other countries, HPV, as we heard earlier, is a much more significant issue, and maybe they're fighting for resources to do it. I think the one difference that we see outside the United States versus in the U.S. is when a country decides something, whether it's a cancer screen, an STD screen, or something else, is important and they decide to cover it from a reimbursement point of view. Those decisions do happen on a national basis and they tend to be fully compliant. So Scotland decides that they want to screen for cervical cancer with image-guided cytology. The entire country, if you will, of Scotland is then doing that. And in the United States, we're still much more fractionated than that.
Yes, and the only thing I'd add would be around your question around does the incidence vary based on screening? Absolutely. You can look country to country. Not so much Europe. UK probably has the most diligent screening process. But as you look around the world, there's a direct correlation between how well the country performs the screening versus the cancer outcomes. But there are even situations, for example, in parts of South America where they actually plotted screening versus incidence of cancer. You would expect more screening, less cancer, but it was a scatter plot. And that speaks to you've got to have systems and processes in place and make sure that the test is taken properly and that the right instruments are in place and that you have quality control. So It's not a simple matter of just screening. You've got to have the whole infrastructure in place to ensure the quality and effectiveness of the test.
Any last questions for our panel? Well, I want to thank Lisa and Jenny in particular for being here today, taking their personal time to share deeply personal insights into the successes and ongoing challenges of healthcare and in diagnostics particularly. Also thank Carl and Bonnie for being here as well to highlight some of the things that our member companies are doing to advance this field. And thank all of you for your time. Thank you.